Hey, Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective, your Christian nerd bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun. In this video, I'm going to be looking a little bit at the LGBT social agenda and talking about that in relationship to the cultural changes taking place in our culture and how we look at that as Christians. So the topic of this video was inspired by a viewer who commented on one of my videos recently. And he says, "Hey Tim, huge fan, love your videos, especially on the different Bible translations. I know you've covered social issues before, so I'm wondering if you can do a social commentary on what you think about the trends, changes in our current society, specifically gender issues in the LGBTQ+, what it means to us as Christians. Thanks." Well, thank you, William, for that idea and for your encouraging words. I appreciate that. So I want to address what was brought up in that comment and talk a little bit about the LGBTQ issue. And first of all, I just want to say that this is an issue that has been talked about a lot in our culture. And in some ways, I feel like everything that needs to be said has been said by someone, and many points have been made about LGBT issues. But, it is an important thing we need to think about as Christians, and it's definitely something that our culture has been impacted by so much and continues to be. Even right now, we have many businesses that are promoting Pride Month for the LGBT community, and certainly the culture has shifted in its thinking over the years. And I think it really is an important question we constantly have to think about. How do we look at this as Christians? How do we interact with the culture as Christians on issues like this? Because the culture clearly doesn't take the position that traditionally Christians have taken. And so I want to look at that. But here's actually something I wanted to share with you that I wrote on the social media platform Parler, or Parlay, however you want to pronounce that. And here's basically what I said there, which is that the church is the light of the world, not vice versa. So think about that. The church is the light of the world, not vice versa. I think we have to remember that we are, according to Jesus, to be the light of the world. We're bringing light into the world and not the other way around. It's easy to get that backwards and to really take our cues from the world, when in reality, we have to think about where we're starting from. And so here's what I said. To know how we're going to live as Christians, we have to follow the Word of God, not the word of culture. And that's a challenge for us all the time. I've talked on my videos before about how the culture is changing. And it can be confusing. It can be overwhelming when we think about how we interact with culture. We need to interact with culture. We shouldn't just run away and corner ourselves in and barricade ourselves off from the world. We need to be engaged in culture, but we also have to be careful not to let the culture be really the foundation for how we look at everything. We are supposed to learn from our surroundings, and God has given us His general revelation. At the same time, we have to think about authority in our lives. I love what happens when we're reading in the Bible about Jesus' teaching, and after He gives this teaching, it says at the end of Matthew 7 that the crowd was astonished because He taught them with authority and not as the scribes did. So I think it's so important when we think about what we're taking our cues from, that we remember Jesus is the one, for us as Christians, who has authority. And even in His culture, it surprised people. They were astonished because they were used to their scribes. Those were their experts in the Jewish culture that they looked to for guidance. But Jesus kind of cut through all that, and He spoke with authority. He says, "You've heard all of these things, but this is what I'm telling you." This, in other words, is what God is telling you. So we have to think about that. What's our authority? And this is very important when we're determining right and wrong. And so I think the LGBT issue is a case in point. It really challenges us to consider, what is it that determines for us what is right and wrong and how we look at the world. We have to admit that our entire culture is being swayed into a new way of thinking about these issues. There's no doubt about it. And I remember when I was young, I was born 40 years ago, the world looked at these kinds of things very differently. I know our culture did, but as time went on, that has changed. And I remember as recently as 2008, I believe, Barack Obama actually said in 2008 his view on marriage was that it's between a man and a woman. I'm pretty sure I remember him saying that, and yet a few years later, he was changing his perspective, and he was saying, my views are evolving. Why were his views evolving? Because culture was changing. Now, this isn't to do any political bashing, so please don't misunderstand me. But what I am trying to say is that that is a good example of how people's views are changing because the culture is changing. And so we always have to ask ourselves, what is the foundation for my viewpoint? How do I determine what is right, what is wrong? Where is my authority? So for Christians, our starting point, I believe, has to be Jesus. As I was saying before, Jesus taught with authority. And for those of us who follow Jesus, he is our authority. He's the one we have to really look to. We have to say God is the one who determines how we look at everything and what is right and wrong. And here's a real point I want to make in all of this about the LGBT issue. I love to step back and just look at this not only in our cultural setting, but think about it over the period of human history and look at it in Jesus' day. And here's a really important thing to think about, that God's design for marriage has always been challenged. God's design for marriage has always been challenged. And I will show it to you in the Bible in a situation that happened with Jesus in Matthew chapter 19. It says, some Pharisees approached Jesus to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any grounds? Haven't you read, he replied, that he who created them in the beginning made them male and female? And he also said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked him, did Moses command us to give divorce papers and to send her away? He told them, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts. But it was not like that from the beginning. I tell you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. His disciples said to him, if the relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. So you can see in that story that Jesus, first of all, is challenging the Pharisees, those who were testing him, and he was challenging their view, and he was saying that even though Moses did allow in the law that they followed, the Jewish law, to divorce, that wasn't God's design. It was really because of sin, right? Because of the hardness of human hearts. And so God does allow divorce in some cases, but it's not his perfect will. It's not his intention. His intention from the beginning, Jesus said, is that a man would marry a woman and the two would become one flesh. And the idea there is that that one flesh is never to be separated. It's to be for their entire life. Now, that's the Christian view of marriage. That's the view Jesus gives. What's interesting is not only do the Pharisees try to challenge Jesus about marriage, but even the disciples of Jesus had a problem with this. You see what happens at the end of that story, where after he gives the view on marriage and he's basically saying you shouldn't divorce, the disciples are saying, well, then why even get married? It's better not to marry. So you can see that humans have a hard time looking at this issue from God's perspective. The reason that I bring up marriage is because it does tie into the LGBTQ issues, but also this hits on the issue of gender roles, the idea of man and woman. And certainly our viewpoint in our culture is that men and women now are looked at in certain ways that the way that we see in the Bible, it's very different than how we look at it. Now, I'm not saying that everything you read in the Bible in their culture was always done right. Again, you could see in this story that they had some wrong thinking about marriage and divorce, and they tended to mistreat women. Jesus was totally against the mistreatment of women. On the other hand, our culture has ways of skewing things and looking at men and women and all of those issues in our own way that I think is a distortion of what God wants. And so we always have to get back again to the authority of what God says, the authority of Jesus and how he looks at things. And I really believe that that's going to help us as we look at issues like this. We have to be continually renewed in our minds. And I talked about this not long ago, how Paul says we're not to be conformed to this world. And there's all different ways that we can be conformed to the thinking around us. He says we have to be renewed in our minds. And so we constantly have to go back to what Jesus says. And he'll challenge all of us. So for us as men, Jesus is challenging us to be loving, to be sacrificial in the way that we act as men, in the way that we lead. For women, it's to be respectful, it's to be honoring to husbands, and to be not so concerned about your outward beauty, but about the character of your heart. And so those are challenges for both men and women. And Jesus is speaking into these things. But clearly our culture is changing, and I'd love to keep talking about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on issues like this. But I just wanted to share and just make this point that, number one, it's so important we remember we're the ones that are the light of the world, and we have to get our authority from what God shows to us. And we have to be committed to looking at things his way. But also, when it comes to issues like gender roles and marriage and things like that, we have to remember that societies have been struggling with doing things God's way from the beginning. This is always a problem. Marriage has been skewed in many different ways. Polygamy has been the way that people conducted marriage in other cultures, even in Bible times. And really what Jesus was saying was challenging that too. One man, one woman. But Jesus' words also challenge our culture. So this has always been an issue. So we have to be the ones as Christians looking at things from the authority of Jesus, but we also have to recognize as we're dealing with culture, this is nothing new. Culture has always had a hard time following what God says. And I hope if you are a Christian, you'll be encouraged, number one, to stand on what is right, but number two, to do it with grace, with the understanding that many people in our culture, they really don't understand things from God's perspective. So where do we start? We start by sharing the gospel. That's really important because as people's minds and hearts are changed by the power of the gospel, then they begin to see the reasoning behind why God says what he does and why Jesus gives us the perspective that he does. Even in Jesus' day, they had a hard time with that until they were converted and came to faith. And so that's the same today. People are not going to believe and understand these things until their hearts are changed. So as Christians, we have to be that witness. But those are some of my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.